morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Cornwall Council for Ryan Ward, farmer and marathon entrepreneur. This question is for Mr. George Eustace, MP. As a small dairy farmer, which was, give up milking in October, that's allowed me to run all these marathons. And in your speech, you only mentioned organic once, and we've been organic since 1997. We have found organics quite, well, we thought we'd get a little more respect during organic, but it's been quite challenging. And when it comes to the certification, we have to be certificated, we then have to have a red tractor, then we have to have farm visits, and there's RPA, it's DEFRA, as was, now it's TB. I just want to know, are you going to have some joined up thinking now with organic people? And also, we've never been able to claim countryside stewardship, which sounds really odd, seeing that we're organic and already environmentally friendly anyway. Thank you, over to you.
Okay, so I regularly meet the organic producers as a national organisation, and we are discussing what role we should have for an organic scheme in the future. And there's two ways of looking at this. One is a lot of the payment for public goods that I described would naturally benefit organic producers. So one model would be to say, if you structure a payment regime along the way that I've described, then organic producers would be natural beneficiaries of that and could enter that generic scheme and be rewarded very well for doing so. The other alternative would be to have a bespoke organic package. And now the industry currently saying that they probably prefer the latter, but they're open to discussion on this. So we are giving some thought to that and how we support organics. I mean, at the moment you'll be aware the Soil Association are responsible for accrediting organic producers, and once they have that accreditation they can get a premium in the market for their produce, but also they qualify for an additional uplift on their single farm payment at the moment, so they get that. And it is also the case, I think the majority of organic farmers would be in some kind of higher tier scheme. I mean, I know there's a particular problem with countryside stewardship at the moment. One of those that, one of the simplified packages we've done, there isn't an organic one, and they said they'd like an organic one. But things like HLS, ELS, HLS in particular, organic producers often access.
No, that's not technically true, really. I think organic people should automatically qualify. Myself personally, that's my opinion. And secondly, we have to pay quite an extortionate certification fee to be organic, and that's regardless whether you're 1 to 50 acres or 50 and above. And the other thing, we still have to comply with all the other regulations as well. So that's red tractor, whatever assurance scheme you have. So to be quite honest, we're actually treated quite badly, really, in the small farm sector.
Next question, please.
Chris Jones, a farmer from Morgan Valley, Middlecombe. Now, what she said, completely concur with being an organic farmer. But back to the chase. This idea that we're taking a 25 to 50 year kind of time horizon to be looking at how support mechanisms should work and the outcomes of that, I think is fantastic, and the government should be congratulated on that. However, in my short time of being a farmer since 1990, we have gone through iteration after iteration after iteration of farm support. Can we get something kind of written into stone in the ministry that once we get something set up and running, that we don't bugger about with it every 5 years as we have in the past?
Well, the reason, it's not every 5 years, it's every 7 years. And there's a reason for that, and that is the European Commission have terms of 7 years, and every 7 years they reform the CAP again, and again, and again, and again. And what's tended to happen is over time, it's become bureaucratised more and more each time. And they talk about simplification, but it normally ends up being more complex. There's been some progress made in some areas, but we've ultimately got a system today that is probably more complex than any that we've had before. My answer to you is what I'm trying to achieve as we think about future policy is to set up a framework that has two things. First of all, we shouldn't pretend that we're going to get it right in year one and then be able to leave it like that forever. In fact, that's been the problem with the way the EU's approached it. They have a stab at getting it right. They make all the compromises necessary to get it through the European Parliament, to get agreement to the Council with all those different countries. There's 1 million farmers in Romania, all of them very small, part-time, usually with 2 or 3 dairy cows. Very different situation in Holland, very different situation here in the UK. Getting a policy that works for everyone is clearly very, very difficult. But what they do is every 7 years they have a stab at it, find out after 3 or 4 years that it's not working, try and patch it up a bit in the interim, but don't get that right either, and then have another go at reform after 7 years. What we should do instead is set up a framework where you can get cross-party consensus between the Conservatives and the Labour Party about what a sensible approach to agriculture and farm support and delivery of agri-environment outcomes looks like. But then recognise that different governments will come in with slightly different priorities, might want a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that, and accept that they need the freedom to do that. That's the first thing. So the way to have settled stability is to secure cross-party political consensus about what a coherent modern agriculture policy looks like. And that's one of the things we're trying to achieve through this paper, is to set out something that will be built to last, not because we're passing some rule that says it's against the law for a future government to meddle with it. We can't do that. That's fundamentally against our constitution. No parliament can bind its successor. But just because it's rooted in good thinking and sound ideas, that becomes the norm anyway. The second thing that I'd say is I think it's very important that we allow the development of these schemes to be quite iterative. That you might try things, and you may find that something that works in Cambridgeshire won't work in Cornwall, or won't work in Devon, and so you won't pursue that. We need to have the flexibility to be able to tailor and design schemes that work, county by county, water catchment by water catchment, and enable that to be quite an iterative process, so that after 10 years you've got something that's way better than year one. And then after year 2 and year 3 it gets stronger and better and more refined all the time, without causing disruption to what you've started. There's a middle way here where we can have something that is progressively refined and improved while not chucking out everything that's been started and chopping and changing endlessly, which is the problem we have at the moment.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Matt Edworthy, the director of a small environmental charity called the Gaia Trust, and listening to what George Eustace said today, I would wholeheartedly approve of bringing farming, people, wildlife together. That's what we stand for, and I think that's the direction of travel that's being taken at the moment. And although I understand the principles and some of the objectives, what I think wasn't mentioned was the overall size of the pie. That's quite important, and I just wondered what the government's thinking is looking 2 years, 5 years, 10 years about the overall size of the pie from which those farm payments come.
It's a very good question, because none of this works unless it's properly funded. And we've been clear in our manifesto that we will keep the agriculture support budget, that's Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, at exactly the same level as it is now until at least 2022. There will be no reduction whatsoever. That is a commitment for the duration of this Parliament. The Labour Party, I know, matched this as well, so they've said the same thing. So there is cross-party consensus that we should be spending circa £3 billion a year on supporting the farm environment, just as we do today, until at least 2022. But we've also got a manifesto commitment to then replace the current system we've got with a new system, and we've been clear that we will phase that in over a period of 5 years. And as I explained earlier, even if you had a reducing cap, basically around 80% of farmers would be unaffected in those initial years. So while we've not put a precise figure on what will happen after 2022, because that is an issue, frankly, for our next manifesto in roughly 2021, We are clear that we will be replacing current schemes with new schemes, and those will be funded schemes.
I'm very aware that we are addressing a lot of our questions to George. Has anybody got a question that's not for George? Just give him a bit of a rest. This gentleman over here.
Hi, Orlando Kimber. As a little boy, I grew up in the centre of London. And for me, liberation was the park, a highly cultivated area, of course. And I've got a question for Lucy and Victoria, really. Given the heartening talk of values, of sustainability, of animal welfare, of high quality, and we're touching on branding as well, the idea of a national park for Cornwall has come up again recently. And as somebody who's advised governments on how to communicate, this has to come, any brand that we project has to come from discourse, it has to come from the people at large and a wide area of people. But I'd like to hear from Lucy and Victoria what they think of the idea of a brand of National Park Cornwall to present what we do. Thank you.
Is this working? Yes.
Yes.
There is a review currently on designations, which is beginning, I think, later this year. And all the nature of national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty will be thoroughly reviewed. From my personal point of view, I think the AONB structure in Cornwall works very well for Cornwall because it allows freedom for commercial development, which would be much more restricted in a national park. I grew up in a national park. I grew up on Dartmoor, and so I feel that I've seen both systems quite thoroughly. And living in a national park can be very restrictive, particularly on business development. And I think Cornwall is fortunate because it's got two overlapping systems. It's got its AONB system and it's got its World Heritage Site system, which are both fragmented, but mean that quite a lot of Cornwall is covered by interesting designations already. So, on balance, I wouldn't want to see a national park in Cornwall.
I think that, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think that national parks can be really useful where you have a large area of landscape that needs protecting as a whole. Cornwall doesn't have that in the same way. We've got parts of Bodminmoor, parts of West Penwith, which are like that, but they're small, fragmented areas. I think it's very difficult for people to have a livelihood and a sustainable future within that landscape. I don't think Cornwall's suitable for it. I think that they are fantastic things where they have their place and where they're in the right areas. But for Cornwall, no, I don't think so. I think that the current system that we have needs strengthening, it needs investment, it needs support to do the great job it's already doing. But I don't think it would be helpful for the economic future of the county or necessarily environmentally either.
Sue, Colette, do you want to add anything to that?
No, as Victoria said, just to kind of just clarify that within the 25-year environment plan for DEFRA, the government have announced a route and branch review of national parks and AONBs. So I think we let that process happen. But just to be really clear, that AONBs have the same status as national parks in terms of their level of protection, how planning is dealt with, national planning policy, etc. So I think Cornwall would probably be better served if it got behind the designation of protection that it already has and sees that working even better than it is already.
Yeah, and I think what I can say is I think we are starting to look at how we can, I mean, as part of my portfolio, there's the term Better Business for All, which is where we work with businesses that want to do the right thing, and you can therefore have a lighter regulatory touch because you're confident of their ethics and their values and that they're going to do the right thing. And I think we're starting to look at that in terms of planning, that perhaps we can set some environmental standards And some of those environmental standards will also overlap with protecting our landscape. And we can perhaps accredit those developers because we'll have more confidence that they're going to do the right thing and work with the environment and the landscape rather than seek just to make the maximum profit.
Thank you. Next question.
Can I just respond to that?
Yeah.
I just, perhaps the phrase national park conjures up a distinctive idea. What I'm actually proposing is that we define what a national park performer would look like, rather than necessarily fit into prescribed models, and use that as a brand to project our identity. So that was really the so thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Alison McGregor and I'm here to represent Cornwall against Dean Supercoin and the Lizard. I'm afraid it's a question for George. George, from the 3-year campaign, sorry this is to do with the sea, but it's become quite apparent that the European status, the special area of conservation, which I believe that the Helford's got, has tighter environmental protection than the UK MCZs, marine protected areas. Through the transition from European law, as we bring that down, is there any chance that we can make sure that the UK's MCZs have got more protection? Because you know the story, you know the scale of the development that could come if tidal lagoons in Swansea and the rest of the fleet go ahead. But I think the point is that do you think there's any likelihood that we can see the marine conservation zones around the UK waters get this special legal protection, which I don't think they quite have in comparison to the SACs and the European law? Thank you.
So what we're doing on all of those designations is the EU withdrawal bill brings them across. In the case of the manacles, which is the MCZ, Marine Conservation Zone, which is a domestic designation off Dean Quarry, that is protected, so it's a protected area. You're right, Zane, there's a slight difference between the SACs and the SPAs, which are the European designations, and the MCZ, which is under the European system. It's quite silent, so you're not allowed to take account of any economic factors as well alongside that. That can be quite damaging. We've seen with the huge difficulties of just doing quite simple things sometimes in the SACs around Falmouth Harbour, for instance. It can make it very, very complicated. So they're not perfect, but they are slightly different in the way that they are constructed. But our intention is that those will simply come across in the first instance. Look, on the Manacles site, my understanding is that although there's been talk and early discussion, there isn't actually a formal application coming in for this at the moment. And indeed, there probably won't be unless the Swansea Lagoon goes ahead. So everything is slightly on hold, in a holding pattern until that decision is made. But I have, on a couple of occasions, had discussions with both Natural England and the NMO about the protection of this MCZ site and ensuring that would be done the right way.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Lucy Isaacson. I'm the chair of Cornwall Flood Forum and from Climate Vision, and I'm going to come where I can see your faces. I'm Diocesan Environment Officer for Truro Diocese as well. So my question is for Sue and Colette, really. I'm a big fan, sorry George, of natural capital accounting. I'm really excited about it, more so because I think it's a great way to be able to communicate. Am I using this?
Yeah, you're okay.
It's a great way to be able to communicate all the different things about ecosystem services that a lot of the people out there don't know. It's also a great way to say that stuff can have a metric, and yes, the economists will get their heads around it. The engineers have got their heads around flooding. Now we've got a new lot of economists that are going to get their head around this. I'm really excited about it. I wanted to ask you if you are as well. I went to a conference about it last year, and there the Forestry Commission got up and said, we've worked out Kilda Forest. We've got a value if we sold it tomorrow, and we've got a value for its ecosystem services, natural capital accounting. And she said, yes, the spreadsheets are boring, but it's 7-8-fold in its value. And I think those sort of things are the things that will help this movement go forward when we're talking about sequestering carbon, taking care of all that rain we're going to get through climate change, and so many other things. It's massive, it's really positive. Can I ask you what your view is, and perhaps we could have a pilot in Cornwall?
Lucy, thanks for your question. We share your enthusiasm about natural capital accounting. I think, as George said in his presentation, there are some pitfalls around natural capital accounting that we really need to be careful about going forward. But for the AONB, we did a project, AONB-wide project on natural capital last year. So we have baseline information on natural capital now for the whole of the AONB. We need to improve and refine that going forward. And I would really like to work with DEFRA actually to understand better how we can use that information and then apply it to the new systems for farmer payments. Because if we're serious about actually paying for public goods on farmland and paying farmers to deliver outcomes that might not necessarily be food production and it might not necessarily be about wildlife, then we need to understand what those outcomes are that we want to achieve. We need to know, we need to have the basic information there to set those outcomes, and we need to be able to understand how we can monitor on that. So I'm really, really keen that we work with DEFRA going forward to try and, through the transition period, work with farmers in an area to see how we can make that work simply on the ground.
I think as a council, we are sort of in the current administration, we are being wise, and I know in terms of sort of cost-benefit analysis decisions and whether you invest in things, you know, it perhaps was going too far in terms of, you know, will this stack up financially and just looking, you know, from a bean counter's perspective. And I think we are now beginning to sort of get it in and on the table that there's more than that. There's environmental issues, and I think the natural capital comes in. There's also social issues that we have to think about. So I think across the council we're thinking that way. And what I said to you in terms of, you know, better planning for the environment type idea, I believe that that's part of that. I sat down just this week with our head of planning, and natural capital was part of what would be, if you like, the criteria for a developer being able to demonstrate their credentials in being good. We've got to work with the environment. There's no good as fighting it. You know, we've got to work with it, and you know, I think we all love the landscape and the planet, and we don't want it. You know, I think probably at my age, we perhaps unwittingly have been doing things that we've been very good at, and we've got to start turning that around. And it's no good just sort of saying we're going to stop things going wrong. We've actually got to, you know, actually go into reverse and put things back. And I'm determined that's a council that we are driving that forward now. And so I hope that you will see that we are going to make a difference. And I think it very much will come into the our county farm review, because, you know, I've had critics, you know, post to me on Twitter or wherever that, you know, oh, this is just about you wanting to build houses on the farm, and it's nothing to do with us wanting to build houses on farms. It's about us looking at, you know, how can we look at the future of our farm strategy and make sure that environmental growth is part of it, and that we're looking after the planet.
Next question.
Good morning, everyone. Afternoon now. My name is Janet Haley.
Question.
My name is Janet Haley from. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janet Haley from Bradford Parish. Third time lucky. Janet Haley from Bradford Parish. Councillor for question for Councillor Sir James. We're all here talking about the environment. Braddock and St Pinnock parishes have the undesirable property of landfill site, Common, in our parish. We are very, very concerned about the extra miles that are going to be used up by many, many lorries, counting to thousands a year, by putting the shredder, which should be at the St Dennis incinerator site, being put at Conan landfill site, which is probably 20 miles away. So for every lorry that comes into Conan to take rubbish to be shredded, which will then continue down the road again to St Dennis, is a huge, huge amount of environmental damage. And your comments, please.
I mean, we've been talking to a forum there, and the reason for that is because we've got to weigh up whether actually purchasing a shredder is a good idea. And as part of the weighing up, we're going to, if you like, lease one temporarily. And the only place that's got planning permission that permits it is the site you're talking about. So we're not necessarily, well, we aren't envisaging that will be the long-term location. So it's a short-term location, and that's because that's where the permissions are in place for it to go. We're not envisaging it being a long-term solution. And, you know, the Energy Recovery Centre may well be the place that it ends up, but I don't want to predetermine that as well, because, you know, we're just about to go into a new waste contract, and we're going to be talking to other waste companies, and we'll be looking at the future. And so that is the short-term answer to where it's going. It's not a long-term answer, and we will be monitoring. And, you know, I'm passionate about the environment, and if our if you like, testing it out there shows that environmentally that's not a good idea, then it won't stay there. So, you know, it is a short-term answer because that's the only place it can go at the moment, but it's not, I don't believe it will be the long-term.
Can I just answer that? How many times have we seen temporary move into permanent? Many times.
I give you my commitment that just because it starts there doesn't mean it eliminates.
One very last question, quickly.
Thank you. Back to farming. Martin Haywitz, speaking sheep farmer from the Tamar Valley, AONB, the other part of the Greater Cornwall AONB that we tend to forget. My question for the panel is the comment that our farming minister made as regards food not being a public good. I'd be interested in the panel's view on this. Minister reminded you that the first two words of the AP consultation document is health and harmony. We've had no reference to that at all here today. We know that farming, food production and the landscape are inextricably linked, but I think we underestimate the value food provides to our health. I believe the figures for obesity that the NHS have released is cost the country £16 billion a year just to try and get on top of obesity. We're talking a budget of £3 billion for the total farming industry. We're part of that solution. Could you please, as a panel, recognise the importance of food production as a public good and not just as a byproduct of the countryside?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be, and I think, you know, I talked earlier when I opened about, you know, the older people in the audience will remember life without plastic. I think older people in the audience will remember life without so much processed convenience foods, and I think, you know, we've come forward as a generation of people losing connection with how their food is produced, and I think we have to get that back. And I think farming and our landscape and our rural areas are also good